Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jenny Nielsen with Grantmakers of Western Pennsylvania. Thank you all for joining us for this session, which is part of the Keystone Policy Series, which is put together by Grantmakers of Western Pennsylvania, Philanthropy Network Greater Philadelphia, and the NEPA Grantmakers Forum. It's designed to share with Pennsylvania funders information on selected policy issues, and today we're going to focus on what funders need to know about the 2020 census, and most importantly, how philanthropy can play a role in ensuring a fair and accurate count in our state. Before we begin, I have to cover housekeeping, a few housekeeping items as always. You'll notice that all the lines except for those of our speakers will be muted. That's to prevent interruptions and distractions. You can use the Q&A box to enter questions throughout the session at any time. We'll try to be as responsive as possible to those as we go through the session, but we will have time specifically for discussion at the end of the session. All you have to do is unmute your line by pressing *7 and just remember to remute by pressing *6. Also, I just want to let you know that the call is being recorded, and the recording will be available as a resource along with the slides following the session. Joining us today, we have Jocelyn Bissonette, Director of the Funders Sensitive Initiative at FCCP, who will provide a national overview. And then Erin Casey, Executive Director of Pennsylvania Voice, and Joe Lynn, Coalition Manager of Keystone Counts, will provide an overview of statewide activities and the needs that are happening within the state. And then we'll open the call to allow for you all to share, an opportunity for you guys to learn from one another what's happening in your region. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jocelyn. Jocelyn, give me 1 second and I will unmute you.
Can you hear me?
Okay, yep.
Great, thank you so much. A big thanks to Philanthropy Network of Philadelphia, NEPA Grantmakers Forum, and the Grantmakers of Western Pennsylvania for hosting this important discussion. Next slide. Again, I'm with the Funders Committee for Civic Participation, focused on our Funders Census Initiative, which is a network of more than 300 individuals from foundations and philanthropy serving organizations. And we're a network where individuals can get access to information, connect with one another, and access census resources. We think that this network is really important because, as we know, the decennial census happens only every 10 years, and so there's not dedicated or established programming, and there's a lot of relearning that needs to happen collectively, so that we can best support communities in their efforts around the 2020 census. And FCI is one of the ways to facilitate that collective learning. Next slide. So I know that those of you on the call have background around what the census is, why it's important, and generally why it's really important for philanthropy to engage. So I'm going to move really quickly through my first couple of slides and then focus more on what's happening at the national level and then some of the resources that are available and some of the approaches to funding, as well as a timeline to think about your engagement. But I couldn't do a presentation on the census without just mentioning that it is part of our Constitution, and the Constitution is very clear that we count everyone. Next slide. But while the federal government is legally obligated to count everyone, we also know that the census is not equal opportunity. So every person in each community all across the country doesn't have the same likelihood that they'll be counted or the same or be compelled to complete the census. In fact, we know there are groups, including communities of color, immigrant communities, young children, that historically have been undercounted. For example, in the 2010 census, missed more than 3.7 million African Americans and more than 3.8 million Hispanics of any race. And what's important to underscore here is that undercounts of specific communities distort both resource distribution as well as political power, which are things that many of our organizations are working to address by empowering communities. Next slide. And while these challenges exist in every decennial census, there are a couple of unique challenges to this particular count, which I want to highlight. Most of you probably know that this will be the first primarily digital census. And also that federal funding has been reduced and delayed, which has caused disruptions in the rollout of the communications plan, a reduced number of field offices and staff, as well as canceled dress rehearsals. In addition, we know that the current political environment, including the addition of the citizenship question, which is currently before the Supreme Court, has just amplified community reluctance around the count. And we know, based on the messaging testing that's been done, including by the Census Bureau itself, that the addition of the citizenship question makes it more likely that immigrants and mixed status households and people of color won't participate. And even though Title 13, which offer the strongest privacy and confidentiality protections that exist in this country, which can't be superseded by any other law, people either don't know them or they don't believe them. And there are certainly incredible validity to those concerns. Next slide. And so at FCI, we like to think of the importance of philanthropy's engagement in the three buckets of the data, the dollars, the districts. Again, you all know how important census data are to not only driving strategic investments within your own organization, but having a really clear picture about what this country looks like and what are the trends and how it's changing over time. That accurate data is critically important. And again, the data are critical for the distribution of resources as well as the distribution of political power. And so the numbers that will be counted next year are baked in for 10 years. And so again, communities that go uncounted are really invisible within our system for a decade. Next slide. So planning for the census is well underway and has been well underway for some time. It's a massive operation. The decennial census is the federal government's largest peacetime activity. And so I wanted to take a minute to highlight a couple of key peak moments in terms of the Census Bureau's operations and your foundation engagement. So now and over the next couple of months, the Census Bureau will be opening and staffing field offices. They'll be hiring for and conducting address canvassing to make sure that we have a complete address list. That is really critical to a fair and accurate census. And then by the end of June, the Census Bureau will go to print on more than 1 billion pieces of census collateral. In January of 2020, the count starts in remote Alaska. The first person to be counted in the decennial census is a Native person. The self-response phase will really kick off in March, and non-response follow-up will end in July. So the whole process, as massive as it is, will be basically through in a little over a year. And so now is a really critical time for our foundations to engage, to identify what that engagement will look like, to make the case internally, to identify how your organization will collaborate with other funders or stakeholders or field groups, and ideally to complete grant making before the end of this year to make sure that the organizations that you're supporting have the resources and the planning time necessary to be able to do that education and outreach ahead of when we'll hit peak operations next year. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that's happening at the national level. The philanthropy work is being driven by three organizations. The Democracy Funders Collaborative Census Subgroup, which developed a plan of action back in 2015 to support strategy around both the policy side as well as the Get Out the Count activity around the 2020 census. We are partnering, and then FCI, in partnership with the United Philanthropy Forum, of which FCCP is a member. Our efforts are really focused on engagement to and support of organizations like yours, state and community-based funders. And what I really want to underscore here is that all of this effort is specifically targeted around those historically hard-to-count communities. And that's what really differentiates our focus and our strategy from what the Census Bureau will be doing, which is a broader, more general campaign. Next slide. And this is a list, a couple of examples of the types of activities that the collaborative of national funders are supporting. If your organization is interested in contributing to this national pooled fund, in addition to the work you might be thinking about at the state or local level, there's an opportunity to support these types of efforts, including developing culturally resonant messages, developing a network of expert national hub organizations. A lot of the mapping and analytics technology that many of your organizations have been relying on to really think strategically about how to target your work have been supported by these national funders. And supporting a digital academy is one of the projects that's well underway to be able to provide support and training to organizations who may not have, to be able to broaden their capacity to conduct both a grassroots door-to-door campaign as well as digital campaigns. And the other thing that is important to mention here is that national funders are really empowering state and local funders to fund within their states and communities. They're not doing as much direct funding to state and community-based groups as they did in 2010, and that was based on feedback directly from organizations. And so, the feeling is that there are only so many resources that exist, but also that organizations that are closer to the ground have a better sense of communities' needs and can be more responsive and reflective of the communities that they're serving. Next slide. And again, these are a couple of the examples that an organization like FCI are providing to state and community-based funders to support your work. Next slide. And one of those resources includes a state landscape scan that was published about 2 months ago that was looking at the funder models of engagement. And some of the themes that came out of that report, you can see them listed here, and the full report's also available online. Investing in relationship building and co-creation with historically hard-to-count communities, making sure that the communities that will serve as those trusted messengers within communities have a seat at the table. Leveraging existing infrastructure, but again, also thinking creatively about who are those trusted messengers in the communities. Is it a service provider? Is it a faith-based leader? It's those on-the-ground discussions, neighbor to neighbor, family member to family member, that we know is really what makes a difference for people to take a civic action. And I also want to take a moment to point out here that funder engagement looks really different state to state, community to community. You have states like California, for example, which was really engaged in 2010. They have a statewide table, but they've also established regional tables, and their model is really an aligned strategy that's happening both at the statewide and regional level, in part because the state is so big. You have states like Massachusetts where their resources are being directed through a statewide pooled fund, but that statewide table is also hosting regional pooled funds to facilitate the involvement of regional or community-based funders that need those resources to go directly back to the communities that where they're mission focused. You have states like Michigan, where the Council of Michigan Foundations, the statewide philanthropy serving organization, is really leading the way, and they're also managing the pooled fund there. And then you have a state like South Carolina, where funders are using the census as an opportunity to collaborate for the first time on a statewide civic engagement strategy. Most of the funders there are community-based, and so they will likely go with more of an aligned strategy. So again, those are just a couple of the examples, and I provide those as a way to say that there are lots of different ways to engage, and you'll hear some more specific examples of what that looks like specifically for Pennsylvania a bit later in the call. Next slide. And so these are some of the, again, because this happens once every 10 years, funders have lots of questions about what this looks like and what are the things that they should be considering. These are some of the myths and objections that we hear commonly in our one-on-one conversations with funders. Hopefully, all of the information that you've learned about the census over the last year addresses these concerns in your mind. We know that the census is ultimately the government's job, but that they cannot be successful without the engagement of philanthropy and the nonprofit and the business sector. There are just too many barriers to a complete and accurate census count. And again, it's those trusted messengers on the ground that we know are going to make the difference. At its core, the census is the collection of data for statistical analysis. The census has been politicized, but at its core, it's really a non-political process. Again, whether you're a place-based funder or your mission is broad or narrow, whether you're focused on healthcare or environmental justice or racial justice or education, the census is so critical to all of the work that we do, regardless of what your regional or mission focus is. And then again, because of the great work of our national partners and your PSO partners, we hope that you don't feel isolated in this work and that you feel like you have the support that you need to take on this important work. And then just my last slide. And we'd like to, again, really think about funder engagement around the census in a really broad way. At FCCP, we think about it in these three buckets. Participate could mean helping to educate state policymakers about why this is important, or helping to create a complete count committee. Philanthropy has incredible convening power, so use that power to bring together stakeholders from the government, business, and philanthropic sector with community-based organizations. And invest. We hope ultimately that you will invest. There's incredible urgency to this work, but you've already got a statewide plan in place and incredible engagement and already at the table from the nonprofit sector. You can also think about engagement as add-on grants to your current grantees, contributing to a pooled fund, or setting aside some funds for emergency response. Next slide. So again, thank you for the opportunity to participate in today's discussion. There is incredible urgency to this work, but lots of time to still think about strategic engagement and supporting organizations like our next speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Jocelyn. And now we'll move on to Erin and Joe. I have unmuted you both, so if you just test your line.
Great, thank you so much. So this is Erin Kesey. I'm the Executive Director of Pennsylvania Voice, and Joe Lynn is with me. And the two of us are going to talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing since 2017 to prepare for a fair and accurate census. If you could go to the next slide. Pennsylvania Voice is a statewide network of organizations that have been working together to build the civic engagement infrastructure since 2010. The partnership every year comes together to set both short-term goals for the year and long-term goals. And as we started looking at the work that was in front of us, the partnership, who really works specifically in communities of color and the immigrant population, recognized that the 2020 census, if not done correctly in Pennsylvania, could have serious consequences for the very communities that they work in. And so we decided in 2017 to launch a statewide coalition called the 2020 Census. Next slide. As a reminder, what's at stake for Pennsylvania is that we could have a serious consequences for our Commonwealth over the next 10 years, whether it's in representation. If we see an undercount specifically in communities of color and the immigrant population, right now we're projected to lose 1 congressional seat. Some models have said that we could lose up to 2 if we see undercounts happen in different places. Obviously, Jocelyn already talked about the way that foundations and elected leaders and community leaders really rely on census data. And then the other is resources. If you could go to the next slide. Just as a reminder, and hopefully all of you, I think there is one slide before this. Can you go back one? Okay. Never mind. So the one resource that, and we can send this out after this call, is just to remind people that census data helps to determine how much resources the federal government is allocating for your state. In 1 year alone, we as the Commonwealth received over $39 billion in federal funds that were derived from census data. This funding helped to support everything from Medicaid to SNAP to special education to infrastructure, so many of the issues that all of you care the most about and the programs that your communities rely on get funding from the federal source. If you go to the next slide, this really gives you a sense of what does that look like for Pennsylvania if we start thinking about where we have the biggest concerns around potential undercounts. As Jocelyn mentioned, historically, the Census Bureau has had challenges in terms of counting communities of color and the immigrant population. For us in the Commonwealth, what we're seeing is that both of these communities are actually growing in the state, 12 times faster than the white population. And so much of these communities are expanding beyond just Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, but they're going out into counties across the state. So as we start thinking about what is the role that nonprofits can play in ensuring a fair and accurate census, we first start looking at where are the counties that we think have the biggest risk. This map helps to identify the 24 counties that we think without a concerted get out the count plan could see potential undercounts in the 2020 census. If you go to the next slide, the coalition worked together to specifically start thinking about what could we do starting in 2017 and moving forward. These are the goals that we set with our coalition partners to really think about what work needs to happen in 2019 and needs to happen through the spring of 2020. The first is that we want to make sure that at the state level, we are taking serious the need to have an accurate count, and we're pushing the General Assembly to invest in state funds to support nonprofit organizations and to support counties to actually do education and outreach in their communities around the importance of the census. The second is we are working with the national organizations to support federal advocacy efforts that are needed for a successful 2020 census. The third is we want to continue to identify and expand the coalition in key geographies. So again, we're looking to expand our coalition work in these 24 counties with already having a base of 64 organizations. The fourth is we want to execute a Get Out the Count plan that was written by nonprofit organizations through a learning process in 2017. And then the fifth goal that we have is to make sure that as we go through both the execution of the Get Out the Count plan, that we're building case studies and recommendations so we have that grounding and learning in Pennsylvania about what are the most effective ways for nonprofits to engage in the 2030 election. If you go to the next slide. So let me tell you a little bit more about this Get Out the Count plan. As I mentioned, this plan was really written in collaboration with the full Keystone Counts Coalition. And they started really thinking about what needed to happen through the process of ensuring that communities that are harder to count for the Census Bureau are engaged early enough to participate. And so in 2017, the partnership and the coalition really went through a long learning process of both working directly with the Census Bureau to understand their operations, where they have seen undercounts in the past, and what we think we could do to overcome the undercounts in the 2020 election. And so the Get Out the Count plan is really based on knowledge from nonprofit organizations across the state of understanding what it's going to take. And the critical piece here for these nonprofit organizations is that it's really looking at what is it going to take to move the most at-risk households to participate in the 2020 census. And the bottom line is it's going to take one-on-one engagement. So if you go to the next slide. This Get Out the Count plan has a couple of key features to it. First, it's really based on a multi-layered one-on-one engagement to specific individuals. We've been able to identify 1.2 million households in these priority 24 counties that the Census Bureau is predicting are less likely than all of the households in the state to actually participate. So we know that doing a multi-layered one-on-one engagement will help to move people to take that action. And this is really based on research of what does it take to move people into a civic action. And we know that it takes them anywhere from 7 to 12 times hearing about something to actually take a civic action. And so we're really looking at layering in this one-on-one engagement to those most at-risk households. The other key element of this Get Out the Count plan is knowing specifically what households we're talking about. When we talk about the 1.2 million households, we're really looking very specifically at a neighborhood level of which households that we think are more likely to not participate without this one-on-one engagement. And then the type of outreach work that we're doing is really based on best practices of canvassing at doors and events, phone banking, text messaging, pledge cards, and mailers. If you go to the next slide. So what I'm going to do is hand this conversation over to Joe Lynn, our coalition manager, who will then talk about who the coalition members are and what the timeline looks like for this Get Out the Count plan.
So as Erin mentioned, our coalition is currently comprised of 64 organizations and still growing. So there are a certain subset of our coalition members that are really well-versed in the civic engagement work that Erin mentioned will really move households to action, whether it's going the door-to-door to knock and engage households in one-on-one conversation, or it's the phone banking, the text banking, the pledge card, and mailers. These are all proven methods of moving individuals and households to civic action, and we're leveraging these partners' expertise in carrying out the Get Out the Count plan. However, for our coalition members that are new to this civic engagement work, engaging on the Keystone Counts Coalition is actually an opportunity for them to build capacity to do this type of civic engagement work for the long term. So what's been exciting since I stepped into this role is I've really intentionally continued to expand our coalition, and not only focusing on the key geography of those 24 priority counties that we saw on the map earlier, but specifically focused on organizations that have grassroots ties to their communities, because we recognize that those organizations are going to be the trusted messengers in their community and are going to be more effective and have that name recognition when it comes to talking to those most at-risk households. In addition, we are working with funders that are interested in funding this type of civic engagement work to identify which subset of their grantees would benefit from, not only benefit from engagement in this coalition, but also could benefit from that long-term building of civic engagement capacity. And so you'll see this on a later slide where we have where we list out potential ways for you all who are on this call to be able to help us in this work, and that is to identify the grantees that could benefit from joining our coalition. With all that said, in terms of what a coalition signs, what an organization signs onto when they join the coalition, so we certainly welcome any 501c3 nonprofit that recognizes the importance of the census and wants to do education and outreach just amongst their internal members and their community. So, which is to say that engaging with the coalition does not have to be a big lift. I know that many of your grantees and community organizations that you work with are stretched to capacity given their existing day-to-day work. And so part of my role as a coalition manager is to make participation as simple and as streamlined as possible so that coalition members can still take action despite that capacity. Signing on to the coalition allows us to use their name when we communicate about the coalition. They also agree to attend meetings to educate their membership. But I also work with coalition members to identify the areas in which they would like to grow. And so when we talk about this building of long-term civic engagement capacity, it's me having those one-on-one conversations with these organizations to identify which ways their communities could really benefit from being engaged civically for the long term, so that participation in this coalition also supports a nonprofit organization's existing goals. We definitely don't want to try to add in a program area, and I encourage coalition members to weave in census messaging and census education with their existing programming work. So if we could go to the next slide, I'll just go over the timeline for our coalition's work. So one of the things that Erin had mentioned as one of our goals for 2019 and 2020 is to do that advocacy on the state level to try to get the state legislature to dedicate public funding to census outreach and education in recognition that this is such an important thing for our Commonwealth that it's not only philanthropic funding that's going to be needed, but also public funding. And so one of the things I was able to engage coalition members in doing this past April 1st, which nationally was known as Census Day of Action, we utilized that opportunity to put in calls and emails to state legislatures so that they would know about the importance of the census and the need to dedicate funding for it. And so we will continue that advocacy between now through the end of the budget cycle to try to raise, to try to have a line item in the budget for $12.8 million or $1 per person in the Commonwealth. Beyond that, I am going to continue expanding our coalition partners in those 24 priority counties, taking recommendations from funders and looking into grassroots organizations and onboarding organizations between now and the end of the year. Another exciting initiative that I'm just starting now is to conduct grassroots message testing. And what that means is for our coalition members to really convene small groups with their community members. And these small groups function almost as focus groups, but the idea is to have a two-way conversation about the census in which community members are not only learning about the census, but they get a chance to share how they feel about the census. What are their, what messages are motivating for them to participate? What fears they have? What barriers they experience to completing the census? And then all of this feedback in focus groups across the state will be aggregated and written into a communications plan that will not only lift up the common themes and the most effective messages that we heard across all of these groups, but this grassroots messaging plan will then serve as the basis for how we then derive all of our field operation materials. So whether it's the literature that we hand out at the doors, whether it's the scripts that we use for the phone banks, we want all of that in terms of how we communicate about the census to be really grounded in community members' voices. And then towards the end of, starting this summer, but going through May 2020, so throughout the entire census get out the count plan that we have to execute. We will be conducting trainings, goal setting, coaching, and ongoing technical assistance with our coalition members. And this is the critical piece of the work that will build capacity for our coalition members, not only to execute the Get Out the Count plan and to provide that one-on-one engagement to the households that need it most, on the doors, over the phones, in text conversations, and at community events. But this serves as the basis for them eventually, even beyond the census, being able to mobilize their communities to other civic actions, whether it's to register to vote, whether it's to voice their comments on a state policy that may affect them, or another civic action that benefits their community. And then in terms of our field operation, we have 2 phases of that. So one phase, phase 1, will be in the fall of this year, and that's in acknowledgement of the fact that a certain subset of our partners will be doing nonpartisan electoral work with voter registration and get out the vote for local races. And that it's a chance for them while they're at the doors and over the phone and engaging their community members to weave in census messaging. So people are already starting to hear about the census and starting to get familiar with the ways in which the Census Bureau will then send out mailers and invite people to respond. And it's also a way for us to collect additional feedback from community members in terms of how they're thinking about the census and what ways they would prefer to complete the census, what help they would need in order to complete the census. And then the bulk of our field operation will be in early 2020. And the reason for that is we really want to drive up the self-response rate to the census so that households are self-responding, so that the Census Bureau, with its underfunding and smaller field capacity relative to previous years, will not have as long a list of households to follow up with on the doors, acknowledging that that is the most expensive part of their operation. And the last piece, of course, is going through the field operation to then distill the lessons learned. And this is just like the coaching and ongoing and technical assistance will be done one-on-one for organizations so that they can learn not only from this experience of having participated from this field operation, especially if it's their first time, but then for them to learn, what were the most effective pieces of that operation, and for them to know a breakdown of in the methods that they did engage their community. Like, let's say an organization were to engage their community over phone and over text. What were the relative effectiveness of each of those strategies? And then how might they, let's say, change the script, or how might they change their pool of households in terms of who they targeted to ensure an even more effective outreach program for the next time they want to mobilize their community to a civic action. And next slide, please.
So I think this is Erin, and I apologize if you could go to the next slide. Something must have happened in the upload. So how you can help is that, as Jocelyn said earlier in her presentation, there is still a lot of learning that needs to happen around the importance of the census and how it impacts communities. And so the different ways that people can help is, one, host meetings and trainings for your grantees about the importance of the census. We here at Keystone Counts and Pennsylvania Voice are able to help provide these trainings and do more one-on-one training so that organizations are continuing to really understand what they can do. Two, for organizations that are interested and are able to engage in the advocacy efforts both at the state and the national level. Three, identify and recommend organizations that you know that should be joining Keystone Counts. And then the fourth is, supporting the coordinated Get Out the Count plan. If you could go to the next slide. Jennifer specifically, wanted us to lift up this Get Out the Count plan. This plan was really written, again, by nonprofit organizations across the state who really spent a year of learning to figure out where they can have the biggest impact. in addition to the work that the Census Bureau is doing and in addition to the work that complements the complete count committees that are happening both at the local and the state level. And so there's a number of ways that as an organization you can help support this Get Out the Count plan. There's both work funding that could go directly to the coalition member organizations who are doing this work, since so much of that work and nonprofits are already stretched, so making sure they have the funding they needed to do this one-on-one engagement, as well as the funding to support in the coordination of this plan, the training and the development of the messaging research, the tools that we are using and providing to all the organizations to do the tracking and the oversight, the data analysis of this program, both pre-launch and then post-program evaluation. And those are different ways that funders can really look to think about how they might be able to invest if that is where your organization wants to go. And so that is the end of our presentation, Jennifer, if you want to move to the next slide.
Great. Thank you, guys. A question did come in, Aaron and Jill, from Amy. How does Keystone Count's grassroots message testing align with similar message testing efforts that FBI has been conducting? So I guess that's for Jocelyn as well.
Hi, this is Joe. Let me answer that. So I actually have seen a lot of message testing that has been conducted by the national group and the national network that we are a part of. And part of our grassroots message testing certainly draws upon that, but we wanted to acknowledge that communities here in Pennsylvania may elevate similar or slightly different themes that the national groups have done. And so part of us being a coalition that's really grounded in being in Pennsylvania is making sure that all of the undercounted communities within Pennsylvania are represented in this grassroots message testing. And part of my role is not only ensuring demographic diversity in the groups that will be taking place across the state, but then to actively reach out to and include demographics that may not have been part of the organizations that signed up initially, so that we are really hearing from communities in Pennsylvania in regards to what they think. I hope that answered this question.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you so much to Jocelyn and Joe and Aaron. It's so helpful to hear from you about what the critical needs are and how we as philanthropy can play a role. And so with that in mind, I'm going to open up the call to hear from you guys. What's happening in your organizations or your regions, and what questions might you have for your speakers and colleagues? I'm going to start first with Jillian Klein at the VNA Foundation of Greater North Penn, and then we're going to go to Kristen Burns at the Grable Foundation. If anybody else has a question or would like to share, please just click the raised hand icon in the lower left-hand side of your screen so that we can try to get to everyone and in order. Jillian?
Hello, everyone. Yes, hi. Hello, everyone. And thank you so much for this. As Jocelyn said in her PowerPoint, don't wait, start now. And I think that's happening in the southeastern region. We've been very excited to work with PA Voice. I know the first time that we saw the map that was presented earlier, and there was a group of red-colored counties right there in southeastern PA, we knew our awareness and our concern was certainly raised. And we've begun to educate our boards and convene local groups and really identify those trusted messengers, which are so needed in the work that not only PA Voice is doing, but the work that all of us are going to need to do from now until next April 1st. It's becoming more and more urgent, and we're finding that there are ways even smaller foundations like ours can respond. We've already funded some libraries, for example, in capacity building, getting their computers ready. It's the first online census that we've ever had. So folks are going to need community places and spaces where they can go and sign up for the census. So we're starting with those kinds of things. But there are larger ways that at the foundation level anyway, we're beginning to look at this. The Fells Foundation has done a wonderful job in leading the way to shift focus on this important work and really begun to be a partner in this effort so that we can coordinate this in a very good way. HealthSpark also has come forward. I really see this as 3 levels of activity. The foundation level that I just mentioned, but then at the county level, we're beginning to see some activity here in the southeastern region. Philadelphia led the way because, of course, they have a major issue in counting some of those undercounted populations and low-income areas and a huge influx and immigrant populations and the homeless to count. So they came out with their complete count committee that is organized into committees around issues that I think will really rise to this challenge. Montgomery County holds their first complete count committee on Monday, that meeting, and Delaware County is coming along. So I would urge funders anywhere to begin to look at what your counties are doing in terms of those complete count committees. Make sure that the folks on those committees are going to be the right messengers, the right ones that are going to have impact in your community. And then at the regional level, I really have to thank Philanthropy Network. They focused their latest annual meeting on the census, and 23 foundations have now agreed to follow up. And I believe that after a call yesterday, I feel very hopeful that we are going to have some action steps locally here in this region to keep the momentum going. And we're looking at things like having concurrent meetings in all counties and all areas on certain dates and times so that we can really focus that work and continue to keep the enthusiasm going, as I said. I do believe that there's some corporate foundations that are also interested, and that is a very, very good sign. We will have a steering committee, but I'm very grateful to Philanthropy Network for taking the lead in that. And so I would just urge everyone at their local levels to look at what you can do to shift your focus at a foundation level, no matter what size of foundation. This is once that we need to get this right, because whatever happens, we will have to live with that for the next 10 years, and that's going to be very difficult. I don't think there's any amount of foundation money that we could plug the huge hole of federal funding if we don't get it right. So I just thank you for the few minutes of time to tell you what's happening in the southeastern region, and I'll let others speak as well.
Great. Thank you, Joanne.
Mm-hmm.
Kristen? Are you with us?
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah.
Sure can. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for inviting me to say a couple words. I'll be quick. I know we don't have a lot of time, and people probably have their own questions. But and the bottom line, why Grable is interested in this issue, we're a foundation focused on kids and learning in southwestern Pennsylvania. So our grantees include school districts and early learning programs, summer and out-of-school time organizations. And the bottom line is that many of the organizations and certainly many of the families who are the people we're trying to help depend on federal funding for their very existence, whether it's through Title I money for school districts or Head Start money or Medicaid and CHIP fund. There are countless programs that are important to our grantees and the people that they're serving. And so really, for us, the investment in census work is an opportunity to leverage our grant dollars. I know we talked a bit about what's at stake, but I'll just say, too, that estimates show that in Pennsylvania, for every person who was missed in the census, the state stands to lose between $15,000 and $20,000. And as Joanne said earlier, that's not money that we can just plug, right? We don't have that kind of resources. So, that's why we're invested in this work. In terms of what we're doing, a number of things. So our executive director of the foundation is actually a co-chair of Allegheny County and the City of Pittsburgh's Complete Count Committee. So he's investing his own time, of course, and his influence there and his knowledge, because he's become deeply passionate about this issue. We've been doing some convening together in collaboration with grant makers for Western PA. Some of our funder colleagues have joined together to create, I would say, a modest pooled fund, but really a pooled fund that's intended to be a little bit of risk capital for some ideas that might be hard, for instance, for our city or our county to float. And we're still waiting for the formal request from the city and the county as to what they would most like, but some of the ideas that have been floated, just to give you an example, range from on the mundane side, money for printing costs. On the kind of wilder idea side, what kind of public art installations could we make that would encourage people to be part of the census? Or could we, in essence, buy out the time of a number of librarians around the county to not only offer access to computers in their facilities, but also maybe guidance and advice in the way that an enumerator would as people are filling out their censuses online for the first time. So we'll see where that might lead. There are a number of funders in our region who are also deeply interested in this topic, but who, for whatever reason, are thinking about their investments independent of that pooled fund. And so we're staying in touch and making sure that our work is aligned, but they're also looking at other strategies in and around the region. So things that I think are important to remember, a lot of these have been touched on already, so again, I won't belabor the point, but this is not political, right? I know if you follow just the mainstream media, it might seem like a political issue, but the census has been happening for decades and decades and is constitutionally mandated, and it does not have to be a political issue. And some of the boards of the foundations around here have gotten more comfortable with that by thinking of this as part of their civic engagement work. So thinking of it together with voter engagement and other kinds of civic engagement topics makes it less scary, I would say, to some of our colleagues' boards. It's not too soon. That's already been said. There are lots of resources nationally and at the state level through the colleagues who spoke earlier that are available to us. Small grants and non-monetary support can be really important. So, when foundations call a meeting, people often show up. And so using that power to bring people together to learn about what's at stake. You can also just simply ask your grantees what they're doing or thinking about the census, and often that's enough to spark some energy and momentum, and share the resources that we know about that can be available to folks. And then really just to be persistent. A year can be a long haul, and some of us have been at it already for some time before that, but I think it's important that we all continue to prepare over the course of the next 12 to 18 months and keep at it, because this is such an important issue with such high stakes for our state. So I'll stop there. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Kristen. Megan Briggs, I see that you have your hand raised. Would you like to hit *7 to unmute your line and share or ask a question? Megan, are you there? Let's see. I'll try to figure out with Megan what's going on here behind the scenes. In the meantime, Lauren Wexler, did you have something to share? You could just hit *7 to unmute.
Sure there. Thank you so much for having this call. It's been really helpful and inspiring to hear about everyone's collective efforts around the state. And I'll just reinforce that I think many of us on the call are probably census evangelists and love getting into the data and all the operational details. But here at Philadelphia Health Partnership, where I work, we've really seen that we have many colleagues around the county and beyond, no doubt, who still need just some basic education around why the census is so important. And I think, fortunately, there's some really good data out there about that. For us as a health equity funder, we recognize that we cannot replace the $221 million per year that come to the census, or that we would lose, if we had a 1% undercount in healthcare resources. And so just pulling out those key messages and really having an organizational narrative that you can use for those folks who haven't yet drunk the Kool-Aid. I think that's really important, just to have some key messages. And I'll just underscore the opportunity in a very time-sensitive way to really be leveraging your relationships with those statewide policymakers, whether it's calling folks in the governor's office, reaching out to those legislators, and really advocating for dedicated public funds. We know that the resources that would be lost in terms of federal contributions to our core safety net programs, they're not something that philanthropy can replace. So it's totally appropriate that we all step forward and really encourage our colleagues to give, particularly with that focus on the hard-to-count communities. But just underscore that, that public philanthropic partnership is really important here. And I think that, we'll certainly try our best. It's going to be hard to do it alone, and that really trying to get some dedicated funds in next year's budget is something that's worthwhile to kind of mobilize your voice around. And so just encourage folks to be talking, whether it's activating your grantees or making those calls yourself. I think it's really important, and just really value everyone's commitments and efforts who are on the call.
Thank you, Lauren. Megan, were we able to get you unmuted? Sorry, Megan. I think we're having some kind of technical difficulties with Megan's line there. I can see you speaking, but I just can't hear you over the phone for some reason. All right, well, we'll try again. Is there anyone else who had something to share or a question for any of our speakers? Okay. If we don't have any others, we will go ahead and wrap up. If you have a question or comment that we were unable to address today, like Megan, or if you think of something afterwards, please feel free to reach out to any of us on the call today. We'll circulate these slides and include contact information shortly after, and Meg and I will reach out to you personally, and we'll try to figure out what happened, and I can communicate any questions or sharing with the group that you wanted to do. But in the meantime, thank you to all of our speakers, Jocelyn, Joe, and Erin, Joanne, Kristen, Lauren, thanks for piping up. We really appreciate all of you, and to all of you for listening in today. Have a great remainder of your day, and keep an eye out for the follow-up information from us.
The conference has been unmuted. The conference has been muted.